study of Masonry deals with how to manage people, how to manage all the communication skills, government, banking, numerology, worldwide. It doesn't matter what your language is, all world leaders belong to the Masonic order, and they act together.
There is a famous statement, which I believe is from William Yeats, though many authors in history have said similar things. It goes, "The veneer we call civilization is only skin deep. Though we like to think that humanity is secure, our more barbaric tendencies lie just below the surface. And thus this statement implies that it only takes a nudge from some other stressor to knock us down several notches. You know, to blow us back into the Stone Age kind of thing." There may be a certain degree of truth to this, but as far as stressors go, the Black Death was perhaps one of humanity's greatest catastrophes. After all, it's estimated that a third of Europe did not survive the pestilence, and now historians feel that that number is woefully low. Worldwide, it's also thought that over 200 million people died. The fragile network of society in some places broke down or was destroyed entirely. And yet, civilization persisted, a new equilibrium was established, and some say Europe emerged in a better spot. With so many dead, the cost of labor skyrocketed and the cost of food plummeted. The landed gentry who ended up on the losing end of this one were now forced to pay higher wages, and peasants and serfs saw their standard of living increased. Indeed, some could even build up wealth to pass on to their children. Furthermore, somebody who was previously indentured to the land now had a better chance of leaving an unfavorable position and moving to a new location with the knowledge that they could be employed. With the need of labor in such high demand, even the position of women was elevated as some took on traditionally male roles. Some historians even go so far as to say that this was the beginning of the end of serfdom. This was going to be a time when old ideas and institutions that had previously wallowed in complacency were now put to the test. People began to take a very insightful re-examination of their own mortality. As such, art, literature, and music were all drastically affected by the plague, as can be seen with the emergence of the danse macabre genre. As Avignon, Paris, Florence, and many other cities were running out of space to bury their dead, England was enjoying a relatively good summer in the year 1348. Her popular King Edward III had replaced the rather unpopular Edward II, who, let's just say, came to a rather unpleasant end, literally. Edward III had gone on to achieve glory against the French at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. His victorious troops would steadily bring back the spoils of war to the port of Calais, where they'd be shipped across the English Channel to an absolutely triumphant Britain. But this train of goods increasingly made its way through a French countryside where the number of cities displaying the plague flag would be increasing by the day. Plus, keep in mind that English wool at this point in history was in extremely high demand, and plague or not, trade continued relatively unabated despite the looming threat. English sheep, after all, in mid-1348, estimated at approximately 8 million, outnumbered English people by a decent margin. That commodity simply had to get out, as other goods needed to get in, and social distancing was just not a high priority. The Black Death came with a vengeance never seen before. Historians in retrospect feel that the plague came from Calais and landed on several fronts. Along the Channel coast, the Great Mortality arrived at Southampton, Portsmouth, and the small port of Melcombe, which is now a part of Weymouth. Another front began at Bristol, where it was suspected a ship from Gascony docked with a cargo of French wine. The effect of its landing was striking and immediate. The local monk, Henry Knighton, described it as, quote, "A cruel death took just 2 days to break out all over town. For many it was nothing less than sudden death." End quote. Now, from these two separate beachheads, one along the Channel coast and the other from Bristol, the plague began to move inland along the roads and the river systems. Now, whereas the average death rate in a city in continental Europe was approximately 33%, in England it would soar to an incredible 55%. And again, this is on average. Some cities would see as high as 80 to 90% of their population perish. Many towns and cities who could simply not bury their dead fast enough would resort to incinerating the remains. A traveler along an English road would see a nightmarish landscape of giant black smoke plumes emanating from every direction, with the ash of the dead raining down upon them. So many people died that industries were left abandoned, fields were untended, livestock would be dying by the thousands in the pastures, and the streets of small villages and towns would be overgrown and retaken by nature. By the late autumn of 1348, the two fronts combined together and then cut a swathe to London, which, as John Kelly, the author of The Great Mortality, would say, quote, "The sanitary conditions of the city were appalling, even by medieval standards," end quote. London at this time was estimated to have had 80 to 100,000 people, of which over half of them would be taken by a particularly sinister 1-2 punch. First, by the pneumonic variant, as the cooler weather of the fall and winter would drive people indoors and thus closer together. And then second, by the bubonic form in the spring, as the warming months brought fleas and rats back into action. But despite this alarming death rate, things were just getting started. For the rest of 1349, the plague advanced to the north, and just like in France, it overran one city after the next. But again, in England, it seemed to inflict death at an unusually high rate as it continued its relentless drive, and by the latter part of that year, it had arrived at the borders of Scotland. John Kelly, using primary source material, gives us the Scottish assessment of what happened next. Quote, "The Scots, who were still laboring under the impression that the plague was an English phenomenon, were enjoying themselves immensely in the summer of 1349. They were laughing at their enemies and swearing by the foul death of England. In March of 1350, the very next year, they amassed a large army in the forest of Selkirk near the English border. And of course, they did this with the intention of invading the whole realm. But before the attack could be launched, the, quote, revenging hand of God reached across the border and shattered the gathering Scots with sudden and savage death," end quote. By late 1349, upwards of 50 to 60% of the British Isles had succumbed to the plague. But this was not the only front. At 2.5 miles a day, it had crossed the Rhine, entering into what would one day be southern Germany, and then from there had advanced to the gates of Vienna. But it was able to cross on more than just land. On the North Sea, the Black Death took to the water and invaded Scandinavia. Ships would later be found adrift, with nothing on board except ravaged corpses. Bergen would be one of the first cities to be hit, but it would not stop there. It moved east, penetrating even into remote areas. Now this would not be the only time an army would be annihilated. Far to the south, plague had arrived in the Iberian Peninsula as far back as 1348. It had come to the Emirate of Granada in 1349. And by 1350, the same year that the Scots were dying at Selkirk, the warrior king Alfonso XI of Castile was on the verge of taking Gibraltar and then had the plan to bring down the emirate once and for all. But instead, at the siege of Gibraltar, his army would be destroyed by Yersinia Pestis, and Alfonso XI would go down in history as the only reigning European monarch to die of the Black Death. Now keep this in mind, as the Castilian army got wiped out here by the plague, the Emirate of Granada would ironically be saved, and thus it would take another 150 years before the Reconquista would be finally completed. With such massive mortality descending on seemingly everyone, a shattered and desperate Europe began to look for answers. Many felt that this was divine retribution for the sins of humanity and turned to religion. Others looked to astrology, and in Paris, considered to be the pinnacle of medical knowledge, The learned 46 masters of the Paris medical faculty congregated and determined that the Black Death was caused by an unusual conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter, which they determined happened at 1 in the afternoon on March 20th, 1345. And I'm assuming that's local time. Now the learned masters got together and assembled a compendium to explain this further. Quote, "The first cause of this pestilence was and is the configuration of the heavens, which occurred in 1345 at 1 hour after noon on the 20th of March, when there was a major conjunction of the 3 planets in Aquarius. What happened, according to the masters in Chapter 2, was that many of the vapors corrupted at the time of conjunction mixed with the air and were spread abroad by frequent gusts of wind. This corrupted air, when breathed in, corrupted the substance of spirit, and thus the heat generated destroyed the life force." End quote. The medicine of the time was based on ideas that ranged back to the time of Aristotle and Galen, who was a doctor who lived during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. As such, it was based on the 4 humors of the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which could cause illness if they were unbalanced, and the preferred treatment was usually bloodletting. However, this method would usually result in the introduction of more infection and/or the loss of too much blood, which would usually hasten death. But when this didn't seem to work, new methods were developed. Doctors would lance the swollen boils, draining the extremely infectious contents out. Now, in some situations, this would actually work, but in others, more infection would simply set in through the new openings. In some cases, they would take this a step further. The buboes were lanced open, and then a concoction of herbs and human excrement was rubbed in. And as can be imagined, this didn't really work out very well either. Now, one theory that came about was the idea that the plague was an airborne vapor, a miasma. And the thought process was that this was something that could be countered by inhaling extremely pure air, hence the reason some people sought solace in the countryside. Or it could be opposed by inhaling extremely foul air to offset some of the noxious odors. This led entire communities rushing to stick their heads into the local latrine. Now, along those same lines, drinking urine became very popular, and specifically non-plague victim urine developed into a treatment, and of course the procurement of this became its own cottage industry. For those rich enough and who decided not to drink urine, a crushed up sapphire that was ingested was also thought to work well against the plague. There were those who also employed fire. Initially, it was applied directly to the body. In some scenarios, hot pokers were even jabbed into the boils of those with the disease. I guess one way to look at it is that one person's treatment is another person's torture. But in other scenarios, fire was actually used as a means to ward off what was considered evil vapors. And of course, fire was also very effective at warding off fleas. Thus, the Pope at the time, Clement VI, would sit between 2 log fires when he was giving Mass. And for the record, he was noted to have survived the plague. Throughout Europe, quarantine would also more effectively be used. The extreme examples would include the city of Milan and a good majority of Poland. In those areas, anyone who showed the first signs of the Great Mortality would be literally walled up. In many cases, they'd be walled up alongside their own families, within their own homes, which now became their own tombs. Now, as vicious and brutal as this may sound, Milan's death rate was only 15%, and Poland's rate was much lower than the rest of Europe. During the years of the Great Mortality, there were a lot of different treatment modalities that were developed, but perhaps the greatest legacy of medical intervention were the plague doctors. To look upon a plague doctor was a foreboding experience. There was a good chance that you were dying when you saw them. But their appearance alone was startling, as they wore the equivalent of a medieval hazmat suit. Donning a thick leather covering with solid boots and thick gloves, their bodies were nearly sealed off from direct contact. The bird-like masks were designed to shield their breathing, the beaks being full of herbs and flowers to neutralize some of the putrid odors. The eyepieces were of glass, but would later be filled with crystal and then dyed red in color, giving one an almost sinister gaze. And some of these would also be offset so that the doctor could not look directly at his patient, as the idea that eye contact could lead to contracting the disease became a thing. In many cases, these nightmarish bird-human hybrids would be the last thing a person would see. And unfortunately, most plague doctors are remembered by history as being nothing more than icons of death. But that said, the people who took up this job put their lives on the line and began to study what they saw. The old ideas of treating patients and medicine in general came under increasing scrutiny, and new methods of treating wounds, pain, and fever, along with investigating the disease itself, were developed. Now, even if they couldn't cure the Black Death, in many cases, these plague doctors still managed to ease the suffering of those that they treated. Now, not all would put their faith in medicine or science. Many also turned to religion for solace. But some would take this to an extreme. A movement known as the Flagellants emerged in late 1348 and early 1349 as the Black Death ravaged Europe. These men and women, in groups as high as 500, would engage in pilgrimages across the continent. As penance for what they perceived as the sins of humanity and a displeased God, they would whip themselves as they went. The whips, by the way, were composed of 3 or 4 ropes, each with a piece of metal or hooks embedded at the ends. Many would march naked. Others were dressed in white robes and hoods, sometimes with a red cross printed on them. A contemporary witness, the Dominican friar Henrici de Hervodia, would comment that the movement was like a race without a head, and would describe one of the members as, quote, "He stripped himself naked and beat his body and arms and legs till blood poured off of them. Then, in an ecstasy of pain and joy, he fell to his knees, and in his cold monk's cell, naked and covered in blood and shivering in the frosty air, he prayed to God to wipe out his sins." End quote. Officially, from a religious perspective, they were rejected by Pope Clement VI as being heretical. For the purposes of the plague, however, they served as a vector, moving the disease along their pilgrimage route. People along the way would know that the flagellants had come. The road that they took, after all, would be splattered with blood and entrails, not to mention the bodies of those who had died in the attempt to find remission for their sins. Now, increasingly, as the Great Mortality took more lives at an unprecedented rate, the various peoples of Europe began to look for someone to blame. The Jewish community of Europe would be one of the major scapegoats. The plague was put into the light of being an elaborate scheme where a vast underground Jewish network had poisoned all the wells. Many Jews were thus rounded up and faced torture to extract forced confessions, after which the pogroms began in earnest, of which the first major one occurred in Toulon on April 13th, 1348. Many would follow, almost throughout the entire breadth of Europe. Heinrich Truchas, the canon of Constance, would say, quote, "Within the revolution of 1 year, that is from All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1348, until Michaelmas, September 29th, 1349, all of the Jews between Cologne and Austria were burnt and killed." End quote. In Strasbourg, it was reported that half the Jewish population was stripped naked, marched into a local cemetery, and incinerated in a stone house. And in Brandenburg, they were placed on a giant grill and burnt alive. But even in these dark, tumultuous times, there were those who provided sanctuary. The city of Marseille in southern France, for example, offered a great deal of protection. The King of Poland, Casimir the Great, would take in Jewish refugees and even forbade persecution. Even the Pope, Clement VI, in a papal bull on July 6, 1348, would say, quote, "It cannot be true that the Jews are the cause of the plague, for it affects the Jews themselves." End quote. But even with the Pope's blessings, not all would listen. In some communities where the Jewish population was slightly less affected, they would be blamed for the plague and killed. And in other communities where it was mostly the Jews dying from the Black Death, The locals would justify killing them as completing God's work. And this would go on for years. Tucetidal, a secluded village that was located high in the mountains, was so badly devastated that nearly everyone in it died. In fact, when a rescue party arrived in 1350, nearly a year later, the only survivor they found was a young girl named Ripe. The poor child, who due to her lack of human interaction and guidance, had reverted back into an animalistic existence. She had begun to hunt wild game like a wolf, and had lost the ability to communicate with words. Now, despite these harrowing stories, the plague would move on. By 1351, the Black Death arrived in Poland, but there it was not able to inflict as much damage. Cities were more spread out, and the king, Casimir III, again also known as Casimir the Great, had shut down the borders of his kingdom and had enforced a very strict quarantine. As I'd mentioned before, anybody in Poland who showed the slightest signs of plague were literally bricked into their homes. And just as a side note, there is one theory that says that Poland had an abundance of cats, which would help to curb the rat population and thus saved a good chunk of humanity. By 1352, the plague had made it to the gates of Moscow, but unlike the Grand Armée or the Wehrmacht, it continued to move east and back into the Eurasian steppe from where it came. Now make no mistake, Europe was left devastated in its wake, but by 1353, the Black Death was finally over. To this, many historians would also add that a new breed of doctors would begin to question their methods of treatment and out-of-date ideas. A now growing middle class would hunger for new concepts and books, and an ever-growing disappointment with religious institutions would hasten Europe into the Reformation. Make no mistake, humanity took a major hit, but it stood the test of time. John Kelly, in his book The Great Mortality, summarizes this really well. Quote, "After 2.5 centuries of rapid demographic growth, the balance between people and resources had become very tight. Nearly everywhere, living standards were either falling or stagnating, poverty, hunger, and malnutrition were widespread, social mobility was rare, technological innovation was stifled, and new ideas and modes of thinking were denounced as dangerous heresies. The Black Death and the era of recurrent disease helped to end the paralysis and allowed the continent to recapture its momentum. A smaller population meant a larger share of resources for the survivors, and as often a wiser use of resources. Human ingenuity also flowered as people sought ways to substitute machine power for manpower. As a result, you had a more diversified economy, a more intensive use of capital, a more powerful technology, and standard of living. Plague in some broke the Malthusian deadlock, which otherwise would threaten to hold Europe in its traditional ways for an indefinite future. Horrific as a century of unremitting death had been, Europe was able to emerge from the charnel house of pestilence renewed like the sun after the rain." End quote.